There are inherent problems and risks to this process because of the variables and uncertainties in the geological and hydrological characteristics of the region that vary from basin to basin. Each frac is an experiment, and despite our best attempts to control these variables and our best attempts to control the engineering, we just cannot understand with certainty what is happening at that level and at those depths. There are significant uncertainties in the methane seeps, the behaviour of faults, the way that gas migrates through these pathways, and this is a complex challenge to communicate to stakeholders and to communicate through science. The lateral continuity of formations, methane fluxes and permeability, a lack of integrated geological and hydrological model to understand this all adds to the complexities of understanding what is happening at that depth. Well integrity is a systematic issue, and I'm going to suggest that they have failed, they will fail, and that they are failing. Bores with poor integrity have the potential to provide pathways for gases and liquids to migrate into and between aquifers, causing contamination of groundwater. Petroleum Safety Authority in Norway has discovered a failure rate of 18%, and 4.5% of Alberta bores have leaked. Bore integrity is still a significant knowledge gap in Australia, and it will always be a risk despite our best attempts to improve technology and control these variables. The question then becomes, what level of risk is this panel prepared to accept? The Victorian Parliamentary Inquiry into CSG has noted that most documented cases of contamination of groundwater with fugitive methane in the United States are attributed to either abandoned or poorly sealed active wells, and there is consensus within the international literature that the major pathway by which cross-aquifer contamination of groundwater due to unconventional gas occurs is through problems with gas and a water bore integrity, particularly the case for cross-contamination with fugitive methane emissions. A factor of this is sustained casing pressure. I have not been able to note the issue and variables with sustained casing pressure in the interim report, and none of the companies have identified this as a variable in the process. Sustained casing pressure is a product of temperature, elasticity in the rock, and depth, and these are variables that need to be controlled throughout the process and that will each eventually lead to bore integrity issues, because it is when pressure becomes too high that we have failures, blowouts, and cross-contamination. Thermoelastic deformations of production casing and surrounding rock change the annual volume observable. The hydraulic fracturing pressure and sustained casing pressure is involved to design the production casing in shale gas horizontal wells. This pressure is a product of the underlying geological strata and temperatures. Again, these are all variables that vary from region to region and would take considerable long-term studies at that depth to understand the dynamics of each fracked well. Van Gogh et al. 2014 studied the Marcellus Shale. In sum, the combined hydrocarbon ratios and helium geochemistry indicate that stray gas contamination occurs in a subset of wells less than 1 kilometre from drilling in northeastern Pennsylvania. While it was noted that topography was a statistically significant factor in these cases, it could not explain the variations in methane and ethane concentrations with respect to distance from gas wells, so they've noted a correlation between the distance and methane and ethane. The migration of natural gas to surface through production casing or well analysis is a common occurrence in the petroleum industry. 3% of all wells in Pennsylvania averages. There is no material that can withstand natural forces over geological time, and this is what we were talking about if we would allow hydrological fracturing. It is only a matter of time. The ability to trace is complicated by a lack of baseline studies on methane concentrations, of which there are none in the NT. At the very least, there has to be a comprehensive independent effort to develop these baseline water and methane studies as a benchmark from which to monitor the behaviour of the industry. Pennsylvania has been a state that has been largely fracked. The industry has been going for many years, and there are thousands of wells. The Pennsylvania Department of Environment Protection published a water supply determination letter which catalogues violations and regulatory complaints from the years of 2009 to 2017. There were a total of 4,000 regulatory violations in Pennsylvania over this period, with 287 complaints leading to contamination. In a lot of these cases, the company has been compelled to provide potable water supply. The question then becomes, have companies in the NT considered the cost of supplying water to rural and regional remote communities once their potable supply is no longer viable? I would like to go through a couple of complaints that are on this register. The first is dating from August 2013. After conducting monitoring of a well in Indiana County after an allegation of pollution, the EPA had admitted contamination had occurred because of its exceedances in iron and manganese compared to pre-drill surveys. The law in that county presumes that there is responsibility of the oil and gas companies in the event of contamination, so they were held responsible in law. The letter compelled the company to provide potable water supply. Another incident from just June this year in Bradford, Pennsylvania, the Department of Environment established there was contamination of drinking water and with manganese and methane. The report stated it is the department's recommendation that all water wells should be equipped with a working vent. This is to suggest that the water wells had to have a vent to vent off the methane so it would not pose a risk to life and property through combustion. They discovered levels of manganese and methane exceeding drinking water standards. They also stated, please note that it is not possible to completely eliminate the hazards of natural gas in your water supply by simply venting your well. There is also the issue of migratory emissions from water wells, which hasn't been included in the risk matrix of the interim report. The analysis of these methane emissions included an isotopic analysis, which concluded that it did come from methane sources associated with hydraulic fracturing. In summary, I'm suggesting that this relationship between contamination and bore well integrity is one as an asymptote, in that it is going to approach zero if circumstances are ideal and engineering is perfect, but it will never reach zero. There is an inherent risk, bores will fail and contamination will occur, has occurred. Another significant uncertainty in this process is what we're going to do with the produced water, and this has not been answered by the companies. An example of the toxicity of produced water is one company in America disposed of their water across a forest. Half of the forest died after experimental spraying with produced water. Within a few days of spraying, 100% of ground cover had died. This is a significant uncertainty that has not been identified, and we still have no idea where this produced water will go.
I'm just going to just speak briefly about some of the economics and some of our concerns, and perhaps if I can just ask a quick question just to clarify my comments. But I was just wondering, is there going to be an opportunity once the economic study is done for public comment on that economic study?
The public will have the economic report, the final report, at the same time as the panel, so anybody will be free to submit whatever public comment they wish to in respect of that report.
Great, thank you for that clarification. And that really does answer one of my questions, because we were hoping that we would have the opportunity to be able to critique it, because as a lot of us do know, is that economists, and I think Rod Campbell has made the point on this around from the Australian Institute, that economists it depends on the model very much on what they're using to define the economic benefit, and sometimes it does very much depend on who is paying for that. So we hope that it'll be very objective.
We're paying for it.
Excellent, and it will be objective. One of our big concerns is the economics of fracking being somewhat overblown. Like, we've been sold the pipeline, the prospect of the Northern Gas Pipeline, which has begun construction. It was sold to us that it would be an opportunity for the state, for the territory, to be able to make up some of the difference of the GST. It's also a way of the Power and Water Corporation being able to cover some of its losses. But we've got some real concerns that electricity and water customers in the Northern Territory are covering the costs of transporting that gas and hence propping up the enabling infrastructure of the gas industry. One of the other things too is that the economics of fossil fuels are declining. There are many reports now that both renewable energy and storage provides a much cheaper cost curve in the long run for energy production, and particularly since the prospect of fracking in the Northern Territory is the most expensive gas potentially in the world, about $7.50 per picojoule compared to the...
Gigajoule.
Sorry?
Gigajoule.
Gigajoule, sorry, compared to 20 cents a gigajoule from Qatar. So I think that it's really important for the Territory, economically, to be looking at how we can be spending taxpayer dollars on the development of a renewable energy industry, and rather than the money being spent on hydraulic fracturing or the fossil fuel industry. So we very much welcome the inquiry and the money being spent to get down to the nitty-gritty of the science of fracking. But we do think that we just need to move through this, get the report done, and make sure the government starts investing in renewable energy.
So further on that point, I would like to acknowledge the work of the panel so far in comprehensively identifying all these heads of risk. It's a very balanced report and a difficult job. The panel has invited our comments on the risk matrix for methane emissions. My comment on this risk matrix is not necessarily a technical one just limited to each category of risk, but I would like to make a general comment on how we are assessing this risk. This risk matrix has made assumptions about mitigation, but I think that we need to go back to the initial question's risk of the obscene amount of methane that is going to be produced through this. You heard yesterday about emissions that are potentially larger than the Carmichael mine in Queensland. This risk to the climate and risk of exceeding our obligations under international law have not been included in this risk matrix. I would also like to draw attention to some volatile organic compounds and other aerosols that are produced in the hydraulic fracturing process. Ozone is a toxic gas and has been consistently correlated with hydraulic fracturing in shale resources across America. Ethane is also produced in this process and is a precursor to the production of ozone. A paper from Bizzi and Monago 2017 has noted a positive correlation with infant mortality in Pennsylvania. There has been a 33% increase in infant mortality with a 95% confidence. This is a positive correlation with fracking wells. There are also compounding health effects resulted to carbon disulfide. The NT has a very young population with high birth rates in certain regions. The possibility of ozone production and infant mortality risks are only going to exacerbate pre-existing issues with access to health care and disease in certain communities. There is currently no monitoring of ozone in the NT or volatile organic compounds. This goes for conventional gas reserves in the Territory. This is a risk that is therefore highly unknown and uncertain, but potentially connected to very serious consequences for childhood and human risk to death. The panel has observed large discrepancies in the measurements of methane emissions, and it is noted that this is a very uncertain variable in this process. It is difficult to bring certainty to these estimations because of the two methods of top-down or bottom-up approaches. While it is appreciated that top-down does come with some reservations in terms of not being able to distinguish ambient air sources from point sources, it is important to note that bottom-up approaches have been consistently shown to underestimate methane emissions. Top-down approaches have not been utilised in the NT, but they are absolutely essential to collaborate our readings of ambient methane and conclude the point sources. Examples of top-down approaches include remote sensing, aerial surveys, and satellite imaging. These need to be employed as well as bottom-up approaches to provide an accurate reading of migratory emissions from all processes of the hydraulic fracturing activities. One uncertainty that cannot be accurately accounted for in terms of engineering standards are migratory emissions. Methane will be going to be seeping up through the ground through faults, seeps, and any other part on the surface that is connected to a gas well. This is difficult to accurately measure by any standards because we're talking about over a large region, and remote sensing is the only way that is going to be able to capture these emissions. I would also like to note that flaring is a method as commonly employed, but note that on average this is only a 70% efficiency. A lot of fugitive methane is thus released in this process, and if winds increase to 15 kilometres an hour, then efficiency of this flaring reduces greatly. So this is another point source of fugitive emissions that has not been accounted for. We are currently not employing strategies that have been utilised in the US, and it is fundamental that we talk about employing satellite, aerial and remote sensing of baseline emissions, and we have this data for many, many years to have an accurate understanding of the ambient methane concentrations in the NT. The National Greenhouse Gas Inventory is the current basis from which we report our methane emissions. But there are deficiencies in this reporting mechanism. A default emission of 0.058 tonnes of methane per kilotonne informs this default emission. But this was only measured from well pads. Fugitive emissions from transport, processing, compressor stations, migratory emissions to the ground were not included, so this standard could not be considered an appropriate default. The methodology for recording methane emissions in Australia has been criticised by the United Nations as being inadequate and not up to best standards. There is yet to be a comprehensive, rigorous, independently verifiable audit of gas emissions. The CSIRO has noted there is no reliable measurements on Australian oil and production facilities. The question then becomes, to what end are we deciding on an acceptable level of fugitive emissions, assuming that we can have an accurate reading? Is it the panel's opinion that we need to get it below 2% because that is what would provide carbon savings? Or is that would provide climate change mitigation strategies? Or is that to reduce the threat to human health? This claim that gas will mitigate from coal in terms of climate change mitigation is not certain, and that there is no way to substantiate a claim of 2% as being able to provide substantial carbon savings. There needs to be a greater emphasis on top-down approaches in this methane monitoring scheme. Aircraft could be used to provide averages of concentrations of methane upwind and downwind of a production region, and this can be multiplied by the advection rate of the air over the basin. This could provide a total average of the basin. We also need to develop baseline climatic studies for each region to understand advection currents so we can get a more accurate reading of methane concentrations. There needs to be a strategic process of monitoring to capture super emitters and ensure that any reading of methane from gas wells is representative of the entire industry. This should be incorporated into the EIS process, or environmental assessments of all projects. There needs to be a framework to compel monitoring and capture of all chemicals associated with unconventional gas production, including volatile organic compounds, ozone, carbon disulfide. The authority best placed to conduct this monitoring is the EPA. It is paramount that monitoring is independent and sampling is randomised. The choice of well inspection should not be up to the discretion of the companies. Mitigation is only possible once all point sources are identified and the localised ambient air concentrations are developed in tandem with an understanding of advection patterns. Now I would like to talk to the hydrology and geohydrology of the Beetaloo Basin and the Lake Woods region. The panel has noted that extraction needs to be approached on a case-by-case basis with modelling of groundwater dynamics in each situation. This is to the credit of the panel. They have noted that much better development into the understanding of this system in the Beetaloo Basin than any other systems in the territory. I have been talking to manager of the hydrological modelling in the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, Dale Cobbin, and I have on good advice that the modelling is not up to a sophisticated enough standard to understand surface and groundwater interactions, and baseline understanding is not sufficient to understand any potential impacts from hydraulic fracturing. She is of the opinion that the Department of Mining has been provided with significantly greater resources to determine the extent of the gas resource, significantly greater resources that have been given to the department to determine the nature and volume of the water resource. This is a theme that generally needs to be acknowledged across the NT. Our level of understanding of groundwater systems is rudimentary and insufficient to understand the complexity of this risk to groundwater systems. The characterisation of the Beetaloo is insufficient and inaccurate. There are near permanent resources and water resides in these regions for over 12 months and in certain cases over several years. What is needed is an independent, in-depth, bioregional assessment into the immense ecological water values of this region. This is a potential that has not yet been realised. Dating of the water has indicated that there are young and old sources of water. This indicates that there is complexity in groundwater and surface water connectivity. There is a lag of a period of potentially decades. This means that we need to be monitoring over such a period so that we can determine any impact on surface water resources and how that flows down into the groundwater recharge points and discharge points. In this dating system, it was noted that the data wasn't stratified, it was integrated, meaning that there is still more work to understand how this dating can connect with the ages of groundwater and surface water connectivities. There is a possibility that the Beetaloo is supporting groundwater-dependent ecosystems on the edges, and there needs to be a lot more work to draw out the location and dynamics, root depths of these ecosystems. Flow in this system is intermittent, but fairly high frequencies. Ecosystems can survive off these sources for up to 20 years, and after a dry period, they will come back. There has not been sufficient rigour into the study of these regions by the department, and this data is absolutely necessary to develop before we can understand what we are dealing with. Dale Cobham was of the opinion that the department is deferring the consequences of any industrial development in this region to later generations before we can understand what they really mean to the ecosystems and aquatic resources. There are also a whole host of springs around the western edge of the Wiso Basin. Springs are incredibly sensitive ecological systems and vulnerable to discrepancies and fluctuations in rainfall and groundwater discharge. It is also important to note that climate change projections are showing that this area will become wetter with high frequency rainfall events, so flooding is likely to become more frequent. The surface water flows to this region are so important they are capable of supporting a huge and diverse range of bird, fish and plant life. Jimmy's going to talk to you on biology of the lake woods.
Thank you. And I suppose we had some concern in reading the inquiry in that there was a lot of talk about the prospective development of the Beetaloo Basin and Lake Woods and Longreach Waterhole. Got a couple of mentions, but beyond that it was downplayed as being an ephemeral wetland. I've only got a couple of copies here to pass to the inquiry, but Lake Woods has got international significance. It's a wetland. It's described as an ephemeral wetland, but it's had water for 7 out of the last 10 years. We've been speaking to some notable ecologists who have been working up there recently, whose details I'm happy to share with the inquiry to follow up. It's primarily fed by Newcastle Creek, and as we all know, Newcastle Creek is right in the middle of the Beetaloo Basin. And Lake Woods is also recognised by BirdLife International as a key biodiversity area, which is something that I think we need to consider. It is under threat. There have been issues of weeds, Parkinsonia and other threats to the region, but that is being managed. The waterhole was fenced off in 1984 to exclude the stock, and there's been a weed management program there to reduce the impacts of the Parkinsonia in the area. It supports hundreds of thousands of waterbirds. In a semi-arid moving into a tropical area, it is described as the largest tropical wetland in Australia. It's at times it can reach 850 square kilometres, and it has reached over 1,000 square kilometres of surface water. It is particularly vulnerable to surface water flows coming down from Newcastle Creek, and as the panel very rightly acknowledged, that most of the threats of fracking do happen as are a result of surface pollution rather than below the ground pollution. So we've got some real concerns that the wading birds, there's internationally significant waders, we've got the names of them here, the painted snipe, the Australian bustard. There's also, we've got from one of the ecologists who's just recently been up there doing a review, and they found subspecies of the yellow chat up there in numbers which they think is globally significant. There's culturally important birds up there, and particularly in an arid zone, it's desert refugia. This waterhole is globally important for migrating birds heading up into Asia over winter. In talking to both of these ecologists, they believe that it would qualify for Ramsar listing if it was put up. There's been no formal assessment. There was a flora survey done in 1992 and another review for the sites of conservation significance in 2007. So there hasn't been any research done on here in 10 years, and there's been water in there for 7 of the last 10 years. So it's difficult to, and especially it's subject to the impacts of climate change. As we see weather patterns change with the potential warming of the Indian Ocean, and we see more of that rainfall coming through the northwest, we could quite easily see Lake Woods move from being an ephemeral to being perennial to long-term potentially being a permanent lake. And I think that we need to consider those risks when we're looking at the Beetaloo Basin. Migratory birds are particularly sensitive to pollution. They are water-feeding birds, so they will source their food from the lake floor and within the water, and that means that if there's toxins that are flowing down the river, that they will be subject to it. There's a larger paleo lake basin there, which demonstrates that there's been wetter epochs over time. So Lake Woods has the potential to be quite larger and more and potentially more biodiversity than what it currently does have. What we can pass on the details for these we've spoken to both these ecologists. Their report is due as part of a biodiversity grant on September 1st, and then they will be happy to release their results publicly. But in the meantime, I can pass on their details for you to contact, and rather than have me talk about it, talk to someone who's actually been there and flown over it and counted these birds. So thank you for that, and I'll just pass over to Alex to talk about Indigenous rights and culture.
There has been talk about fear-mongering in Aboriginal communities about environmentalists and people who are concerned about the impact of hydraulic fracturing. But the reality is that this is a very intimidating and scary prospect for Aboriginal people in certain regions. Economic and industrial development in Australia has historically been predicated on dispossession and dislocation of Indigenous people and Indigenous culture. While understanding that economic opportunity is needed in certain regions, it is a form of economic blackmail to suggest that these communities have to decide between fracking or their ongoing situation on economic issues. Lasting sustainable economic opportunity needs to be based on a solution that is that enables connection of lasting culture and their relationship to land. We need to understand that the impact of fracking is much greater than the immediate location around the wells. There are broad social and political consequences of changing the dynamics of a region and introducing industrialised processes and infrastructure in these remote regions. I will now speak towards the regulatory framework and gaps in the data that have been acknowledged in the interim report, sorry. I commend the report on recognising that there are gaps in our data and there are gaps in the regulatory system that has led to a lack of confidence and faith in the people of the NT in the regulatory system to adequately control this potential industry. As it currently stands, there is no social licence for this industry, and it is not possible, and it may not even be possible, but what is sure is that we would need a robust system that is able to adequately control each aspect of the process. An example of the reasons behind this lack of social licence is the behaviour of certain gas companies in Australia. Origin has been implicated in allegations of covering up regulatory violations and a culture of non-compliance, as they have demonstrated it is often easier to pay fines than to comply with these regulations to protect the environment. The Northern Territory is currently undergoing its biggest reform of the environmental assessment and regulatory framework since such laws were introduced. These reforms are a systematic process of going over mining legislation, water legislation, and environmental assessment legislation. It is anticipated that they will not be complete until 2020, as it is just in the discussion paper stage. Therefore, a regulatory system will not be able to accommodate expansion of the industry for many more years once we establish the models for environmental impact assessment and strategic impact assessment, for example. These systems will not be able to operate effectively once we have many, many years of baseline data on the ambient concentrations of heavy metals, cesium, uranium, salts in groundwater. The Victorian experience shows that the science was inconclusive, but this regardlessly led to political momentum behind continuation of the moratorium. The moratorium must be continued until we have sufficient data and there is a regulatory system that demonstrates the ability to have confidence and hold companies accountable to their responsibilities to the environment and the people. I would now like to go through a couple of examples where the report notes that the data is lacking and connect these to why we need to have a more robust regulatory system, and in its current state it is not possible to accommodate those risks. There is currently no framework or history of monitoring stygofauna populations in the NT. This is an absolutely essential process of all environmental impact assessment. It is not possible to assess the magnitude and frequency of risk of hydraulic fracturing without an environmental impact assessment framework. This process is still in its infancy. Access to justice is an essential component of ecological sustainable development in the NT, and it is acknowledged that merits review and judicial review are essential components of this process. Merits review do not currently exist in the NT, and it will take many years before the regulations are capable of providing this right and understanding how this will work in tandem with environmental assessment. There is insufficient capability or capacity to rehabilitate mine sites. APIA and the DPIR did not comment on the long-term integrity of abandoned wells. There is already a significant and substantial issue with legacy mines in the NT. Red Bank mine is leaching copper into the environment at a rate that is killing all ecosystems downstream. In some sense, copper mines are more simple than the hydraulic fracturing process because all the surface footprint is much more obvious. What I am suggesting is that there is already a regulatory problem with the treatment of legacy mines in the NT. Over 40% of mines that have been decommissioned in the last 20 years are legacy mine problems, and they are discharging heavy metals into the environment. The department has not demonstrated the capacity to be able to deal with the problems once abandoned wells have become abandoned and once they have become decommissioned. There is also no certainty at present about how much recycling of the water could be achieved in the NT from produced water. The question then becomes who will pay and who is responsible. If the situation does not currently exist to regulate mining in the NT, it is a valid question to ask if this regulatory culture is capable of being developed for hydraulic fracturing. There are also considerable issues about the freedom of information about rehabilitation bonds in the NT. The MacArthur River mine is currently fighting tooth and nail to prevent this information becoming public. This demonstrates that it is difficult to have this information in the public realm, which also undermines any ability to develop public confidence in the environmental responsibilities of gas companies. It is a struggle for this information to be released. In any regulatory framework, it is absolutely essential that there is a presumption of causality between fracking and incidences of contamination. The burden of proof must rest with the company to establish that they are not responsible for this contamination, because a false negative is far more damaging than a false positive in this instance. Strategic environmental assessment has been noted in the interim report, but there is no framework and this does not currently exist. Strategic environmental assessment is contentious and is in development throughout the world, so there is no way of understanding how this will be utilised and rolled out in the event of hydraulic fracturing. There is a need for broad-scale bioregional assessments in the NT, but there will be no ability to do this once the regulatory system begins to be developed in 2020. There is also no offset policy in the NT that is capable of understanding the biological cost of hydraulic fracturing. Acknowledging all the above, the point is that this information and the certainty of the science is inconclusive. This is a textbook incident of where we need to operationalise the precautionary principle.
Just to clarify that point, because I just saw the chair wincing a bit about some comments. Just to clarify, when we're talking about 2020 in terms of the environmental assessment and approvals framework coming into place, that is from personal communication through the engagement process that we've gone through with the policy unit of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, where they gave on good advice that it would be at least 2020 by the time we actually had a reformed environmental assessment and approval framework in place.
I understand that, thank you. Of course, we're not bound by that process
Of
in our
course.
recommendations.
Just to put it on the record, that's all.
Investigation of this panel is one of the most comprehensive in the world. It's going to provide insights into hydraulic fracturing in one of the most contentious environmental debates on the planet at the moment. The tension and conflict in this debate, however, is not purely based on science. There are values and foundations for opinion that are not centred on the technical approaches to understanding methane concentrations or mercury concentrations in groundwater. The community of the NT is entitled to make decisions about what economy they would like to see and what direction the society should be taking. It is important to recognise that normative values and statements are informing this debate, and while science is ultimately fundamental in alleviating some concerns, there is a role for the discussion of ethics and a philosophical inquiry into what values inform our risk matrix. We need to include ethical elements so that we can properly adjudicate this debate on fracking. Our political values inform our positions, which means that science will not be able to resolve the underlying tensions completely between the various positions on this issue. The Victorian report was inconclusive, yet it led to policy implications. The value bases of disputes underlying environmental controversies need to be fully articulated and adjudicated through political means before they can play an effective role in resolving environmental problems. It needs to be acknowledged that regardless of the scientific findings, there is considerable community opposition to this, and that there are implications for how the political consequences of having a population that is frustrated and concerned, and these are valid bases to be worried about. This therefore has significant implications for the question of a social licence. Before assuming that a social licence is capable of being developed, we should be asking whether a social licence is deserving of this industry.
And to conclude, we've laid out the case that it's not necessarily one of the terms of reference for this inquiry was how may a social licence be acquired, and we're posing the question: can a social licence be acquired in the Northern Territory? Could it be acquired? Because at this stage there is significant community concern on all sides of the political fence about this issue. And while we very much welcome and applaud the inquiry for its depth of analysis, a good government will take the results of this inquiry and engage the community in the risks and the issues, and then actually ask the Attorney-General to call for a plebiscite on this issue rather than making the decision themselves, because we've got quite a lot of concerns, and this is across the board in Australia, that both sides of the political spectrum are encumbered by donations by the fossil fuel industry, and so we'll be looking forward to the outcomes of this inquiry, but we'll be urging the government to take the findings from this inquiry to the people and put it to a plebiscite. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just had a few comments before and a couple of questions before I pass it around to the rest of the panel. First was, you've quoted from well failure rates from Norway and Australia. What information or data do you have about well failure rates or leaky wells sorry, you've quoted from Norway and Alberta, I should say. What data do you have in respect of Australia?
I don't have anything on hand, but I have papers that I could forward to the inquiry.
On Australia?
On Australian wells.
Good, because of course there are wells that are being fracked in the Mereenie and Palm Valley, or have been fracked, and it would be very useful to find out what the leakage rates are and failure rates are of those wells, given their obvious proximity and no doubt, I'm assuming, and it's an assumption only, geological similarities.
It would actually be great for Central Petroleum to provide those figures. Have they been approached?
Okay, I'm asking you what data you have. You've quoted well failure rates from overseas, but surely the more important data is what's happening in Australia.
And that would be great if that information was on the public record.
What about South Australia? Have you inquired in South Australia? Done some research there?
I can't comment on that, on South Australian failure rates.
We only have ALECs for 3 days a week.
Now, the comments that you attributed to Dale Cobbin, is that person, that individual speaking on behalf of the department, or I think it was herself? Was that right?
It's a
herself?
personal communication.
It was a personal communication, right? Okay. Right. And in terms of social license, how do you define social license? What is it? What do you think it is?
Well, a license in a strict sense is permission to engage in an activity. It's a legitimising process, a form of consent, and the social license is an analogy, society consenting to a process to occur, to saying we accept the consequences of this and we agree to be a give and take arrangement, that coming with mutual sense of obligations.
Is that your personal definition, or is that based on sort of social science research?
I think the concept of a social license, it doesn't have any strict definition, and I don't think any one authority can speak to what that means. But that is how I understand social license.
Now, you quoted a number of papers there in your presentation. If you could make those available in due course, that would be
Absolutely.
very helpful. Thank you. Yes, anybody else? Yes, Professor Hart.
Could I just follow that up? Because, Mr. Cocking, you've made a number of comments which are of vital importance to the panel. I just wanted to run through the key ones from our perspective, the water perspective, and ensure that you'll be providing what evidence you have in your written submission. So you made comments about the inadequate knowledge of the hydrogeology, and that particular person had made some comments. I think you made also some comments about the age of the groundwater, and I didn't quite understand precisely where you were talking about. Some old, some young. Any evidence there would be really useful to us. The whole dating. You also noted the surface water flows, intermittent, Newcastle Creek, and so forth. Again, any info on that would be useful. There's very little, as you no doubt noted, and you guys are in the immediate vicinity, or at least closer.
Only 700 kilometres away.
Yeah, well, that's close here. You talked about springs in the Wizzo Basin. You talked about climate change, where you said the rainfall will be higher. I'd like to see the evidence for that. And you went through Lake Woods. Again, you noted a report coming out from those two ecologists. That'd be very useful to us. But again, any of the evidence that backs up. Yep. Okay. So again, just putting on the record, we would be very interested in any evidence that you've got for those comments and statements.
We'll provide all that to the
Okay.
panel.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, Dr. Anderson.
Yeah, thanks. I've got a few questions. First, a comment on Lake Woods. The panel is aware of the conservation importance of Lake Woods, and in fact, it's our understanding it's Australia's biggest freshwater lake. And we're also aware that even though it lies outside the Beetaloo Basin, it is fed from surface water from Beetaloo. So we are aware of that. So I've got two questions, and they're actually both for Mr. Reid. The first one is that you talked about, in terms of Indigenous economic opportunity, you talked about how Aboriginal people need to choose between a fracking future or an alternative future. And I'm just wondering if you could explain more how you see it's a competition, how being involved in fracking would preclude some other alternative economic futures.
First, I don't want to pretend that I can speak on behalf of Aboriginal people, but what I'm addressing is that the nature of this industry, considering the biological disturbance, fragmentation of habitat, influx of FIFO workers, this interferes with the nature of remote communities. It interferes with the culture of connecting and caring for country. That is antithesis of gas and industrial development. And I can't make those decisions about economic opportunity, but expansion of this industry would compete with other opportunities and other solutions, considering it's unsustainable and wells will eventually run out.
Can I just also add to that is that it's been made very clear to the Northern Territory by the federal government in terms of GST distributions, in terms of which way they think that the Territory should be heading in that direction. And the Northern Territory does, per capita, have a lot more people that require access to government services than per capita anywhere else in the country. And so as a result of that, it does turn it into a dichotomy and a choice in that sense, that the way the federal government has been putting that pressure on behalf of the gas companies. So that's another element to that either-or scenario.
Thanks for that. And then my final question is the issue of social licence, and it's something the panel has been grappling with. And one of the problems is there's very few experiences elsewhere in Australia that we can sort of look at with communities who've experienced this sort of development, and really the only one that's sort of remotely comparable is the coal seam gas experience in southeast Queensland. And so I was just wondering what your assessments might be on where community social licence is at the moment, after having experienced several years of development and production of in this case coal seam gas in southeast Queensland. Have you had any experience or thoughts on that?
Maybe Jimmy's better to
Well,
talk about.
I haven't travelled to those areas. We have a very small budget here at Arid Lands Environment Centre. But just in conversation and with people that we've had, with people from Roma and other communities that have been subject to these issues, and also this is largely due to conversations that we've had in the mall when we've had a Arid Lands Environment Centre store with visitors to town who come up to us when we've had the yellow triangles there and wanting to tell us about the problems and the challenges that they've faced in their communities in southwest Queensland as a result of the coal seam and shale fracking or tight gas that's been happening in Queensland. And people to say, stop it now, don't let it get in, because once you do, then it all changes. And they've, talking about the communities of Roma particularly, and also Chinchilla now, that are under subject of environmental investigation due to the underground coal gasification there. So it's we're basing it very much on conversations that we've had with people, and the conversations that we've had with visitors to Alice Springs here is to not let it in, because once you do, it's never the same again. And so that's what we're basing our concerns around social licence, and based on other experiences around the country, and seeing what also has happened in northern New South Wales and in other areas where people have stood up as communities and voiced their concern about it and actually stood up in opposition to it. We look to that and we see that there obviously must be an issue with it, even though we do have much more remote areas here. The people who are living remotely have, while you can't deny that people and farmers and others have connection to land, the spiritual and cultural connection that Indigenous people have to land goes back to a time that we can't even imagine. And I think that it's really important to consider that when we're looking at social licence for this industry to open up frack fields across the Northern Territory.
We're going to go down this way and then come back up this way. Dr. Jones.
Yes, I'd just like to follow up this issue of social licence and a plebiscite a little bit more, because in a democracy one might say that if all the NT voted on this issue and the result was a resounding no or yes, then that might be clear cut. But I live in a rural regional area, and I know the dichotomy we face between the issues that we view as important and what Brisbane, a couple of thousand kilometres away, might view as important. And I think one has to be very careful about not disenfranchising the people of the regions that are going to be most affected by, if you like, an urban bias. Do you have any comment on that particular issue?
Well, I suppose it's also got to do with the nature of power as well. So it's one thing to have a policy position when you go into an election. It's another one to once you get in there and are subject to the influences of particularly the fossil fuel industry in this case. So as far as it goes, we anticipate that if it was put to a vote, that there would be a simple majority of people who have got more concerns about this industry than don't have concerns. It's one of those things that bridges the political divide in terms of whether it's the people, the Country Liberal or Labor Party, where people on both sides of the fence there are concerned about it. It was one of the reasons for people moving across from being rusted on Country Liberal Party voters to voting Labor in the recent election was because of the fracking position that was the previous government had, among other issues, of course. But I think that we really need to engage in forms of participatory democracy in this place, in this space, because the community has been speaking loudly about this. People have got great concerns about it, and it is really up to government to engage the public on issues of environmental and political importance. This is obviously one of them, and while it's one thing to invest in having what will be an internationally significant report into hydraulic fracturing that the panel will be producing at the end of this year, it's another thing for the public to actually understand what is actually being put to government. And so we will be hoping that the government will take the opportunity to get the good science and the research that has come out of this inquiry and put that out to people, to engage people in understanding the risks. And then again, rather than it being subject to a cabinet decision, we would be hoping that they would put it out to the public, because there's not another election until 2020, and a fair bit of damage can be done should cabinet or ministers be let loose on issues that they, I could go on about this, but yeah, at this stage we've got concern, and we think that it should be put back to the people after this inquiry.
I guess a second question relating to the bridging time, that relates to the current review process of the environmental impact assessment process and so on. Are you seeing, from your point of view, good positives coming out of the changes that are being proposed? I asked this question in relation to the recommendations we might make as well in terms of current regulatory deficiencies and maybe ways of remedying them.
The initial indications are positive. We are openly engaging in that process, and we welcome the changes. The challenges with anything is the devil's always going to be in the detail, and we have been making recommendations to the policy unit of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources to be engaging with national organisations. There's also the Australian Panel of Environmental Experts, in environmental law, which have put together a framework for strengthening environmental legislation, and that's something that we could probably also pass on a link to the panel as well, if it will help in making some recommendations to assist that process. Current indications, we're positive and open. We're just keeping a good eye on it and being engaged actively to ensure that the public are aware of what's going on with that as well.
We'd certainly appreciate any specific feedback you can give us on what you see as a positive and perhaps and or negatives in that process.
Yes, thanks, and we will.
Yes, Dr. Smith.
As Dr. Anderson and Professor Hart have said, we're aware of the importance of Lake Woods, and we appreciate that additional input you're providing there, but we've particularly struggled to get any decent ecological information further up catchment within Newcastle Creek, Newcastle Waters. And it's almost a plea to see whether you're aware of any further studies that have been done in that region. And it's more than just that's part of the Beetaloo. We find that aquatic ecological studies in Northern Territory are polarised to the Arid zone, which has a surprising amount of attention been paid to it, and the top end, and a relative dearth of information for surface water and groundwater ecosystems in the middle. So if you have any knowledge of ecological studies, in particular aquatic ecological studies in those regions, or any groundwater or even fluvial aquifer dependent ecosystems within those areas, we'd appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
Professor Priestley?
Thank you. You quite correctly emphasise the importance of understanding airborne emissions from the industry to better inform the risk assessment of communities around there. You specifically mentioned ozone and carbon disulfide as not being considered very much in the report, and you're right, I hadn't seen very many reports on those particular compounds. If you have specific references on the impacts or concentrations of ozone and carbon disulfide, it would be very useful for you to pass those on. Thank you.
Again, the difficulty is, though, that ozone isn't really monitored in a great deal, but I will do my best to provide those articles. Yeah.
Yes, Dr. Beck.
During your presentation, I think the words were to describe fugitive emissions were obscene risk, and I think you were basing that perhaps on an article that may have been in The Guardian today by Mr. Tim Forsey. I haven't read that article, but I note that Mr. Forsey did make a presentation to the public hearings in Darwin yesterday. All that I'll comment upon is that in the interim report, we have detailed the emissions, greenhouse gas emissions from shale gas operations, and I will note that over time, those emissions have substantially reduced based upon measurements in the United States, particularly with the introduction of the new source performance standards that now require flaring or capture of emissions at the wellhead. So that's one particular point. You raised some issues around, well, are we intending to identify the emissions from full field operations? In the report, there are details there from full field estimates from bottom up and top down measurements. And so we are detailing those. And in addition, we note that we are wanting to undertake baseline measurements. And in addition, we are proposing and seeking input on the actual field measurements to monitor emissions, not from individual pieces of equipment, but from the gas field. And we are looking to perhaps set some limits on those, and we would welcome input from your organisation on those particular proposals. Thank you very much.
So I noted that it was mentioned that Santos is already conducting baseline studies into methane emissions.
I don't know whether I would characterise it as already conducting. I think there are proposals to do that.
Will the details of those proposals be available?
That would be an issue at the moment for Santos to release, but the panel has of the mind to be recommending the need for baseline monitoring, and not only baseline monitoring, but as I just indicated, the desire to undertake measurements in the field which would capture field emissions, not just emissions from particular pieces of equipment.
Can I also just add to that I think it's also critical that these baseline studies are done independently, or at least done by government departments who are charged with the responsibility of looking after country and people.
Agreed, but they must be independent.
Yep.
I know we're already slightly over time, but thank you very much, Mr. Cocking and Mr. Reid, for presenting today.
Thank you.
And we look forward to those extra references and material. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and congratulations on such a well done inquiry so far.
Thank you.